The air inside the top-floor executive boardroom smelled like lemon polish and cold espresso, a scent I had associated with high-stakes commercial hospitality for nearly 25 years. Usually that smell meant a hotel acquisition was closing, or a regional director was getting audited for inventory discrepancies. But on this wet Tuesday morning in downtown Chicago, the tension was centered entirely on my side of the polished mahogany table. Richard Montgomery, the chief executive officer of Crown Luxury Hospitality, refused to meet my gaze. He was 49 years old, the exact same age as me, but he looked exhausted, nervously swirling the melting ice cubes in his crystal tumbler as if searching for answers in the condensation. Across from him sat his 24-year-old daughter, Chloe. She wore a tailored beige blazer that cost more than my first automobile and possessed the genuine commercial experience of a golden retriever. Her fingers flicked across her glass phone screen, her face bathed in blue light that highlighted an expression of pure, unearned entitlement. She had never spent a single hour running a weekend shift, never worked a 70-hour holiday week, and never negotiated a union labor contract. Yet here she was, sitting on the executive board with the title of Chief Innovation Strategist. "We feel the firm requires a more agile, digital-first perspective," Richard finally mumbled, his raspy voice sounding like coarse gravel churning inside an industrial mixer. Chloe has presented several compelling proposals regarding brand disruption and automated guest touchpoints. "Automated touchpoints," I said, keeping my tone measured and quiet. In luxury hospitality, when you lose your temper, you lose control of the negotiation. "Richard, last week Chloe suggested replacing our head concierges at our 4 flagship properties with interactive tablet kiosks to gamify the check-in process. Our high-net-worth clients pay $800 a night, precisely because they do not want to interact with a screen. They want a seasoned professional who knows how to source reserve vintage wine at 2 in the morning. Chloe finally lowered her phone, her sharp hazel eyes fixing on me with icy disdain. "See, Dad, this is exactly the legacy mindset I warned you against previously. Daniel is completely analog. We are pivoting toward an exponential growth model, and we cannot afford to drag 20 years of legacy baggage into our next venture capital funding round." Exponential growth model sounded like something she had skimmed from a tech blog while waiting for an organic oat milk latte. The company was entering a high-stakes merger agreement with a private equity group, and part of their restructuring covenant was a complete reorganization of senior leadership. I had built Crown Luxury Hospitality, brick by brick over 2 decades. I was the operational officer who saved our downtown property during the 2008 financial crash. I was the negotiator who secured our exclusive municipal permits for 3 consecutive years. And now I was being pushed out to make room for a social media influencer whose greatest career achievement was choosing Instagram filters. I stood up slowly, smoothing the lapels of my dark charcoal wool suit. No wrinkles, no hesitation. Never display weakness in front of people who are trying to carve up your legacy. "And my equity buyout, Richard?" Chloe slid a thick manila envelope across the polished table. It stopped 2 inches short of my hands. "Technically," she chimed in with a sickly sweet tone, "the impending merger dilutes all previous equity allocations. Corporate legal drafted the severance packet. It is a standard release agreement. I did not open the folder. I already knew what resided inside. A settlement figure that looked substantial to an outsider, but represented pennies on the dollar for a founding partner, accompanied by a draconian non-disclosure covenant and a strict 2-year non-compete clause banning me from managing or operating any luxury hospitality asset within the state of Illinois. "You are making a catastrophic operational error, Richard," I said, ignoring Chloe completely. "Not because you are terminating my contract, but because you are allowing an amateur to navigate a commercial jet through a thunderstorm. Watch your mouth, Daniel," Chloe snapped, dropping her corporate facade to reveal the spoiled brat beneath. "You are obsolete. Take your severance check and find a quiet hobby." I walked out of that office carrying only my leather briefcase and my professional self-respect. The elevator ride down 40 stories felt like an exit from a funeral, but my mind was already calculating variables. They believed hospitality was merely about balance sheets and decorative centerpieces. They forgot the foundational reality. Hospitality is about ownership, access, and leverage. It is about knowing every vulnerability in an organization. Because you were the architect who installed the foundation, I did not return home to complain or drown my frustration in alcohol. I drove straight to my apartment, sat at my glass desk, and opened my personal laptop. The non-compete clause prohibited me from working for a competing hotel management firm. It did not prohibit me from purchasing commercial real estate. The anger inside me was cold and focused. Every time I recalled Chloe's dismissive instruction to find a quiet hobby, my resolve sharpened. I pulled up public municipal records for the venue where Crown Luxury Hospitality hosted their annual investor gala every November. It was the premier corporate event of their fiscal calendar, the night they showcased their balance sheets to major institutional shareholders. The event was booked at the Marshall Room, a historic four-story estate in downtown Chicago featuring vaulted ceilings, original 1920s plasterwork, and a notorious debt structure. The property was owned by an aging real estate syndicate that had fallen 8 months behind on their commercial mortgage payments. It was a magnificent structure, but mismanaged to the brink of foreclosure. Chloe wanted to disrupt the industry. She wanted to play high-stakes corporate games. I was about to teach her the most fundamental law of commercial enterprise. The entity holding the property title makes the rules. The soft blacklist in corporate Chicago is executed with polite precision. No one sends out an official memorandum warning industry peers against hiring you. Instead, phone calls to senior board members go straight to automated voicemails. Scheduled lunch meetings are repeatedly postponed. Executive recruiters suddenly claim they have no active searches within your salary bracket. Richard and Chloe had worked behind the scenes to frame my departure as a burnout, portraying me as an inflexible executive resistant to modern digital transformation. In the tight-knit circle of luxury hospitality management, perception is liquid capital, and mine was being systematically devalued. But my former partners made one fatal miscalculation. They assumed I was searching for a job. I was not looking for employment. I was building an asset portfolio. Over the next 3 weeks, I liquidated my private investment accounts, drew down a credit line against my residential real estate, and contacted 2 silent investment partners, wealthy private equity veterans who despised unearned corporate nepotism just as much as I did. Together, we established a clean holding entity named Aegis Capital LLC. My daily routine shifted from executive board meetings to grueling asset inspections. I was not interested in buying operational hotel chains that carried massive labor liabilities. I targeted distressed infrastructure, catering logistics centers, commercial laundry contracts, and historic event venues operating near default limits. The Marshall Room was the centerpiece of my strategy. I conducted a physical walkthrough of the Marshall Room on a rainy Thursday afternoon, posing as a corporate consultant evaluating banquet spaces. The building was suffering from years of deferred maintenance. The historic plaster medallions were coated in dust, the velvet drapes smelled of damp age, and the general manager, a stressed gentleman named Mr. Henderson, looked like he was one bad week away from a nervous breakdown. "We offer flexible booking terms for autumn dates," Mr. Henderson said, nervously adjusting his silk tie as we walked across the hollow parquet floor of the main ballroom. "We can accommodate up to 350 guests for dinner." I stopped near the grand mahogany staircase and ran a gloved finger along the wooden banister. The varnish was worn down to the bare timber. "I am not looking to rent your ballroom, Mr. Henderson," I said calmly. "I represent Aegis Capital LLC. We are prepared to acquire the property title, take over your existing commercial mortgage debt, and inject immediate capital into building restoration." Mr. Henderson stared at me in stunned silence, the color draining from his face before returning in a rush of immense relief. The bank had been threatening foreclosure within 30 days. Negotiating the purchase was straightforward because the selling syndicate was desperate. I structured the acquisition through my attorney, a sharp commercial litigator named Victoria Thorne. We kept my personal name entirely off the public filing documents, listing only Aegis Capital LLC as the buyer. While Victoria finalized the deed transfer, I monitored my former company's corporate activities. Chloe was posting daily updates on public professional networks from the executive corner office I used to occupy. She had replaced my classic mahogany desk with an adjustable glass standing desk and announced that Crown Luxury Hospitality had officially finalized the contract for their annual investor gala at the Marshall Room. I printed out their gala press release and pinned it to the corkboard in my home study. It served as my operational timeline. The property closing finalized quietly on a Friday afternoon. There were no press announcements or ribbon-cutting ceremonies, just an electronic wire transfer of funds and a series of recorded signatures at the county clerk's office. At 49 years old, I was now the sole managing member of the entity that owned the building, hosting my former employer's most important night of the year. The following evening, I walked into the empty ballroom alone. The space was silent except for the low hum of the outdated climate control system. I stood beneath the massive crystal chandeliers, looking down at the worn parquet floor. I was no longer an ousted executive begging for an equity payout. I was the landlord. Over the next month, I directed targeted structural improvements. I upgraded the building security system, installing high-definition camera feeds covering every corner of the grand ballroom, the service corridors, and the commercial kitchen. I upgraded the lighting controls to allow precise remote adjustments from an iPad. Most importantly, I conducted a thorough legal review of every existing event contract executed by the previous management team. Buried on page 9 of the standard venue rental agreement for the Crown Luxury Hospitality, Gala Clause 14b, a strict conduct covenant originally drafted to protect venue employees from abusive event guests. Clause 14b stated explicitly that the renter and their invited guests agreed to maintain professional standards of conduct toward all venue management and operational staff. Any verbal harassment, physical abuse, or intentional destruction of property by the renter constituted an immediate material breach of contract, granting the venue owner the absolute right to terminate the event immediately, refuse further service, and eject the renting party without financial refund. It was a standard protective clause that previous management had never enforced. In my hands, it was a precise legal trapdoor. All I needed to do was wait for Chloe Montgomery to step onto it. Corporate ownership transfers are subtle operations when handled correctly. If executed properly, the public notices nothing until the operational checks are processed. I retained the entire frontline staff at the Marshall Room. The banquet servers, kitchen prep staff, maintenance technicians, and door attendants. They were dedicated workers who had suffered under years of weak leadership and uncertain paychecks. I scheduled a mandatory operational meeting with the staff 2 weeks prior to the gala. I presented myself simply as Daniel Mercer, the managing consultant hired by Aegis Capital LLC to oversee facility operations. I did not announce that I owned the building title. Instead, I immediately raised their hourly wages by 15% and issued brand new uniform sets. Tailored black trousers, crisp black button-down shirts, and long charcoal aprons. We are elevating the operational standard of this venue, I told the assembled crew in the staff break room. You are no longer working for a failing venue. You are the operational backbone of this property, and you will be treated with absolute professional respect. The shift in employee morale was instantaneous. For the first time in years, they felt supported by executive leadership. Meanwhile, electronic correspondence from Chloe's event planning team began flooding the venue's operational inbox. Because I had added my confidential alias to the management email distribution list, I observed her erratic planning style firsthand. Chloe did not communicate through structured commercial channels. She sent frantic emails at 2 in the morning, demanding bizarre design alterations. She wanted to install heavy aerial silk rigging from 1920s plaster ceilings that could not support structural weight. She wanted to remove the historic mahogany bar to make room for a futuristic liquid nitrogen cocktail station, and she requested that banquet servers wear painted branded stencils instead of standard uniforms. Axing through my venue director persona, I systematically rejected every request that compromised building safety while approving every modification that inflated her operational budget. I informed her team that structural constraints prevented aerial rigging, but approved the importation of rare South American floral arrangements provided Crown Luxury Hospitality paid a non-refundable cash deposit. I was allowing her to exhaust her event budget while building a paper trail of absurd demands. 3 days before the scheduled gala, Chloe arrived at the Marshal Room for a final site inspection. I observed her arrival from the security monitoring office on the second floor. She strutted through the front foyer, followed by 3 terrified junior assistants, and her father, Richard, who looked visibly aged, his shoulders hunched inside an expensive charcoal coat. "It smells damp in here," Chloe announced loudly, crinkling her nose as she stood on the marble floor I had just paid $4,000 to polish. "Can we pump synthetic sandalwood scent through the air ducts during the cocktail hour?" A junior assistant scribbled frantically on a tablet. "I will check with the venue manager, Miss Montgomery." "And these light fixtures," Chloe continued, waving her hand dismissively at the restored crystal chandeliers. "They look completely outdated. I want pink gel filters installed on every bulb. We need a modern, high-contrast aesthetic for our social media coverage." Richard cleared his throat nervously. "Chloe, perhaps we should maintain a traditional tone for the institutional investors. The board is expecting a conservative presentation." "The board is expecting modern vision, Dad," she interrupted sharply. She turned toward a senior banquet server who was carefully setting silver cutlery at a nearby table. It was Carlos Delgado, a 61-year-old gentleman who had worked at the venue for 16 years to put his 2 daughters through university. "Hey you," Chloe barked, pointing a silver-nailed finger at Carlos. "Stop wasting time wiping knives. Move these heavy chairs into the storage corridor." "I want low lounge seating in this section." Carlos paused politely. "Ma'am, this is a formal 3-course plated dinner. The seating floor plan was finalized by your event coordinator last week. Did I request a lecture on floor plans?" "Chloe," he scoffed, rolling her eyes with intense condescension. "Good help is impossible to find in this city. Just execute the instruction without talking back." I leaned forward in my leather chair, watching the high-definition monitor screen. There it was. The habitual arrogance, the complete absence of human empathy. She treated a veteran service worker as if he were disposable furniture. I picked up my office telephone and dialed Victoria Thorne. "Victoria, is Clause 14B fully enforceable under Illinois commercial property statutes regarding immediate event termination for staff abuse?" "Ironclad," Victoria answered without hesitation. "As long as you have contemporaneous evidence of the breach, witness testimonies, or audio-visual recordings." "I have high-definition video feeds with digital audio capture," I said, watching Chloe continue to berate Carlos over table arrangements. "Daniel," Victoria cautioned softly, "if you trigger an immediate eviction during a live corporate event, you will destroy your former firm's reputation permanently. You will leave them with zero recourse." "Victoria," I replied, staring at the screen with absolute calm, "I am not looking for recourse. I am enforcing the contractual standards of my building." The afternoon of the corporate gala arrived under gray autumn skies. The operational tension inside the venue was palpable. The staff was fully briefed, and I arrived at 4 in the afternoon, wearing plain dark trousers and a simple black work shirt. I went to the employee locker room, removed my silver wristwatch, and put on a long black server apron. I looked into the mirror. The executive officer was gone. In his place stood an anonymous 50-year-old banquet worker, just another invisible face serving champagne to Chicago's corporate elite. My heart was calm, my focus absolute. I picked up a silver serving tray, walked out into the main ballroom, and waited for the doors to open. There is a distinct form of social invisibility that accompanies a service uniform. When you carry a silver serving tray through a high society event, people do not look at your face. They look through you to check if their wine glass is filled. By 7 in the evening, the grand ballroom was packed with 300 prominent investors, corporate directors, and financial journalists. Neon lighting accents that Chloe had insisted on cast a garish purple glow across the historic plaster molding, clashing horribly with the elegant architecture. Moving through the dense crowd with a tray of champagne flutes, I recognized dozens of former colleagues. There was Gordon Vance, the chief financial officer of Crown Luxury Hospitality, standing near the bar, laughing loudly at an institutional investor's joke. There was the human resources director who had processed my termination paperwork 3 weeks ago without offering a single word of gratitude. They looked directly at my face, met my eyes, and saw nothing more than an anonymous hourly worker. I kept my head slightly bowed, responding with brief, polite phrases whenever addressed. "Yes, sir." "Immediately, ma'am." My voice was flat and unassertive, completely stripped of executive authority. As the second course was being served, I maneuvered toward table 1, the head corporate table positioned directly beneath the central chandelier. Richard sat at the middle, looking miserable as he picked at his salad. Beside him sat Chloe, wearing a reflective metallic silver dress, holding her phone aloft to live stream the gathering to her online followers. "We are live at the annual Crown Luxury Gala," Chloe announced into her phone camera, speaking with exaggerated enthusiasm. "We are disrupting traditional hospitality models and redefining corporate luxury." She gestured wildly with her hand, almost knocking over her water glass. I stepped forward quietly, placing a fresh carafe of iced water on the table. Finally, Chloe muttered without looking at me. "Service in this venue is remarkably slow, Dad. We should buy this property next quarter and fire the management." Richard let out a tired sigh. "Chloe, please concentrate on your upcoming keynote speech." The main dinner course arrived. Filet mignon with roasted vegetables. The commercial kitchen operated with flawless precision under my direct instructions. I needed the food and service quality to be perfect so that any operational failure in the room belonged entirely to Chloe. I was assigned to clear the plates at table 1. As I approached, Chloe was mid-sentence, pontificating about executive mindset to Gordon Vance, the chief financial officer. "Leadership is about establishing dominance early," Chloe declared, waving her heavy silver fork to emphasize her point. "You cannot let lower-level personnel question your strategic authority." As she swung her arm, a large piece of seared beef flew off her fork and landed with a greasy thud on the pristine white tablecloth, right beside her wine glass. She stopped speaking, stared at the dark oil stains spreading across the linen, and then looked up, not at the room, but directly at me. "You!" she snapped, pointing a long manicured finger at my apron. I stopped in my tracks. "Yes, ma'am?" I replied, keeping my voice low and neutral. "Look at this mess," she demanded loudly. "Is this how you present a table at a luxury event?" "I apologize, ma'am. I will clear the plate and replace the linen napkin immediately." I reached carefully toward her plate. "Don't just clear the plate, scrub the table right now." Chloe shrieked. The surrounding tables fell silent. The background string quartet faltered as conversation died down across the head section of the ballroom. 300 corporate leaders turned their heads toward table 1. "Chloe, calm down," Richard whispered urgently, his face flushing red with embarrassment. "No, Dad!" Chloe barked, her voice echoing across the silent room. "This is about operational standards." She reached out, grabbed her full goblet of red Cabernet wine, and deliberately inverted it over the center of the table. The dark red liquid poured across the white linen, dripping off the table edge and splashing directly onto my black server apron and leather shoes. "There," Chloe sneered, a cruel smirk spreading across her face. "Now you have a real mess to clean up. Get down on your knees and scrub it, busboy." The silence inside the grand ballroom was absolute. I did not panic. I did not hurry to grab a cloth or offer an apology. I slowly reached into my apron pocket, withdrew a clean white linen service towel, and folded it twice with slow, methodical precision. I stepped forward, calmly wiped the spilled wine from the wood trim, placed the stained towel on my silver tray, and stood up straight. I squared my shoulders, raised my chin, and looked Chloe directly in the eyes. "Table 6 is dirty, busboy," Chloe repeated loudly, trying to regain her dominant posture under the stares of the crowd. "Did I give you permission to stand up? Execute my instruction." "No," I said. My voice was quiet, but in the silent room, it carried with absolute clarity. "Excuse me?" Chloe laughed, a sharp, nervous sound. "Did the hired help just say no to me? Dad, terminate his employment right now." Richard stared up from his seat. He looked at my face, really looked at my eyes, and the color drained completely from his cheeks. He recognized the posture. He recognized the cold focus. He had sat across boardroom tables from me for 25 years, Daniel? Richard gasped, his voice barely a whisper. Chloe whipped her head toward her father. What are you talking about, Dad? I did not look at Richard. My eyes remained locked on Chloe. You suffer from a severe misunderstanding regarding commercial hierarchy. Chloe, I said clearly, you believe that because your firm rented this room for 4 hours, you possess the authority to degrade the people working inside it. I do own this space tonight, Chloe shouted, standing up so abruptly her chair scraped loudly against the floor. My father's company paid $50,000 for this venue. We pay your wage. I could purchase this entire building tomorrow if I desired. Actually, I replied, taking a step closer to table 1, you cannot. I raised my right hand slightly. On my signal, the ambient house lights shifted. The garish purple spotlights dimmed, and the warm architectural floodlights illuminated the head table. Because this property, I continued, was purchased 3 weeks ago by Aegis Capital LLC. And as the managing principal of Aegis Capital, I am extremely particular about enforcing our commercial lease covenants, specifically Clause 14b. Chloe blinked rapidly, her composure faltering. What are you suggesting? You are just a server having a mental breakdown. Security, remove this man immediately. 2 large security officers in dark suits stepped out from the main entrance doors and walked purposefully toward table 1. Chloe smirked, thinking they were answering her command. Drag him out to the alley, she ordered. The security officers walked straight past me, stopping on either side of Chloe. Mr. Mercer, the lead security officer, said to me politely, ignoring Chloe completely. Is this the individual violating venue policy? Chloe's mouth dropped open. Who is Mr. Mercer? Yes, James, I answered calmly. Miss Montgomery and her executive host party are in direct material breach of Clause 14b due to verbal harassment of staff and intentional property damage. Terminate their event access immediately. Richard sat frozen in his chair, his head in his hands. Chloe grabbed a black envelope I had placed on the table beside her dinner plate. What is this line item? She stammered, her fingers shaking as she pulled out a formal, legal notice printed on heavy cardstock. That, I said, is your immediate notice of commercial eviction, accompanied by a $50,000 liquidated damages invoice for contract breach. You cannot do this, Chloe screamed, her voice cracking as she tore the paper in half. We have institutional investors here. We have news journalists in the room. I know, I replied smoothly. That is precisely why I waited until the main course was served. Ladies and gentlemen, I announced, turning to address the 300 guests in the room. I apologize for the interruption to your evening. Due to severe contractual violations committed by the host party against our operational staff, Crown Luxury Hospitality's event access has been terminated. However, the venue bar will remain open on the house for all attending guests. Except the executive board of Crown Luxury, a wave of astonished murmurs swept through the ballroom. Several institutional investors exchanged amused glances, while financial reporters scribbled notes frantically. James, I instructed the lead security officer, escort Miss Montgomery, her father, and their executive team out through the service exit by the loading dock. We need to keep the main foyer clear through the dumpster alley? Chloe gasped, tears of rage finally spilling down her face. It is the standard exit for commercial waste, I said quietly. The walk of shame across the 100-foot ballroom was agonizingly slow. 300 wealthy investors watched in silence as security escorted Chloe and Richard past the mirrored walls toward the rear service doors. The corporate disruption Chloe had preached about had finally arrived, and it had completely dismantled her career. The public fallout following the Marshall Room eviction was swift and merciless. By 8 o'clock the following morning, financial blogs and municipal news outlets were covering the story. The headline in the Chicago Business Journal read, "Luxury Gala Terminated. Former executive buys venue and evicts CEO's daughter for staff abuse." Crown Luxury Hospitality's stock valuation dropped 14% within 48 hours. Institutional shareholders demanded an emergency board meeting to address the public relations disaster, and rumors circulated that major investors were preparing derivative lawsuits against Richard and Chloe for breach of fiduciary duty. Meanwhile, I returned to my executive routine, operating out of the renovated management office on the second floor of the Marshall Room. Aegis Capital LLC was no longer just a holding company. It had become a recognized asset management group. 2 weeks after the Gala incident, an urgent electronic inquiry arrived in our venue booking system. It came from a senior administrative assistant at Crown Luxury Hospitality, requesting an immediate reservation for the Grandview Terrace, a premier waterfront event venue in Chicago. They needed a high-end location to host an emergency shareholder confidence meeting to prevent a total stock sell-off. What they did not realize was that Aegis Capital LLC had acquired a controlling interest in the operating entity of the Grandview Terrace 10 days prior. Victoria Thorne walked into my office holding the printed booking request. "They are desperate, Daniel. No other major venue in the city will touch them on short notice after what happened at the Marshall Rooms. Do you want me to reject the booking outright?" I looked out the window at the Chicago skyline. "No, Victoria. Send them an approved contract proposal." Victoria raised an eyebrow. "You are letting them host their meeting?" "Approve the booking," I said, "but adjust our commercial terms. Increase the venue rental rate by 300%. Require a non-refundable $100,000 security deposit, paid in cash up front, and insert a mandatory clause requiring Aegis Capital LLC to approve all executive keynote speakers to protect our venue brand." Victoria smiled thinly. "They will have no choice but to sign." They executed the contract within 2 hours. They paid the inflated fee from their diminishing cash reserves, completely unaware that their rental payments were funding Aegis Capital's acquisition of their primary commercial laundry vendor. It was systematic financial leverage. Every strategic move Crown Luxury attempted to make intersected with my expanding asset portfolio. 1 month after the gala, the board of Crown Luxury Hospitality officially voted to strip Chloe Montgomery of her executive title and remove Richard from the chief executive office. The firm was subsequently acquired at a steep discount by a national hotel group, which immediately liquidated their remaining corporate assets. On a cold Friday evening in December, I hosted a private celebration at the Marshall Room to mark the completion of our building restoration. There were no social media influencers or flashy promotional displays. The guest list was comprised strictly of our operational staff, key trade suppliers, and the silent investment partners who had supported Aegis Capital LLC. Carlos Delgado sat at a table near the fireplace with his family, enjoying a 5-course dinner prepared by our executive chef. The atmosphere inside the grand ballroom was warm, quiet, and genuinely professional. I stood at the low wooden podium wearing a dark navy suit. I looked out over the room at the men and women who kept the property running every day. "Hospitality is not about subservience," I said into the microphone. "It is about stewardship. It is about taking pride in creating an environment where people are treated with dignity. True authority in corporate warfare comes from legal ownership and asset leverage, not unearned titles." The applause inside the room was genuine and sustained. Later that evening, as the jazz band played softly near the stage, I walked toward the floor-to-ceiling bay windows overlooking the snow-covered street. Outside on the sidewalk, standing beneath a street lamp in the light snow, was a lone figure wearing a long beige trench coat. It was Chloe. She stood shivering in the cold, staring up through the glass at the warm golden light, the laughter, and the professional dignity inside the room from which she had been evicted. Her phone was tucked away in her pocket. She looked small, defeated, and entirely isolated. Our eyes met through the glass for a brief second. She did not yell or gesture. She simply stared, realizing that all the corporate posturing in the world could not buy back the respect she had thrown away. I did not smile. I did not raise a glass. I simply reached out, took hold of the heavy velvet curtain, and pulled it smoothly across the window frame. Brick by block, I closed the view, shutting out the cold street until only the warmth of my building remained. I turned back to the room, walked over to table 6 and motioned to Carlos. "Carlos," I said with a smile, "let us make sure table 6 has fresh coffee and clean dessert plates. Spotless, Mr. Mercer." Carlos replied with a warm nod. "Excellent," I said, taking a quiet breath of satisfaction. "We have operational standards to maintain."